In those days when the people walked as if they were carrying too much weight on their backs, in the narrow streets of Judah, a boy called Zephaniah was born. Son of Cushi, grandson of Gedaliah, great-grandson of Hezekiah, yes, that king who had faced difficult times. His family tree already said a lot. He wasn't just any name in the crowd. There was royal blood running through his veins, but that didn't guarantee him a palace or comfort. On the contrary, he was born into tight times, when faith was cast aside like an old object forgotten in a corner of the house. King Josiah was still young when he began to rule, a boy trying to find his place on a heavy throne while the people lived immersed in practices that God never approved of. Idolatry was like a weed. It grew fast, everywhere. Pagan altars occupied places that should have been holy. Injustice was as common as bread on the table. And in the midst of all this, Zephaniah grew. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he participated. It was as if his eyes could already see what others preferred to ignore. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you'd like to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. While the adults went on with their lives, closing dishonest deals, exploiting the poor, laughing at the idea that God cared, Zephaniah felt a discomfort growing inside, a restlessness that wouldn't go away, as if something inside him was already being prepared. There were no words or visions yet, but the weight of responsibility was beginning to whisper in the boy's ears. And so it was, between dirty alleys and dirty palaces inside, that Zephaniah began to understand that his voice would have to break the silence. But it wouldn't be easy. What he was carrying wasn't meant to please or comfort. It was a warning, a cry from on high. Because as he grew, the chaos around him grew with him, and soon the call would come loud and clear. It wasn't in a strange dream or a vision full of light that Zephaniah understood what he had to do. The call came differently. It came like a tightness in his chest, like a wind that blows against his face when no one else feels it. It was as if the streets were talking, the walls were shouting, people's eyes carried a kind of sadness mixed with arrogance that he couldn't ignore. Everything around him seemed out of place. The shopkeepers were lying on the scales. Leaders, who were supposed to set an example, used their positions to take advantage. Rich people built huge houses with money taken from the poor. And the people didn't even remember what it meant to walk with God. They said that the Lord was far away, that he didn't care, that it didn't matter, as if God were a tired old man with no strength to do anything. These words hurt more than stones. And it was in the midst of all this noise, in the silence between one sin and another, that Zephaniah heard the voice that is not heard with the ears, but with the spirit. A clear, direct call, impossible to ignore. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about his lineage. It was about what was to come. He knew it wouldn't be easy. No one likes to hear hard truths, even more so when those truths break down pride. But the time for keeping quiet was over. It was time to speak out, even if it meant throwing stones at a wall. Zephaniah stood up like someone going against the wind. He began to preach, strongly, bluntly, a warning that was more than words. It was a siren going off before the earthquake, because what he needed to announce was too big to ignore. And as soon as he started, he knew it. It wasn't just Judah that would have to listen. When Zephaniah began to speak, there was no shaking in his voice, no slurred words. He went straight to the point, and no one escaped. It didn't matter if it was ordinary townspeople or a prince in a palace. Everyone was in the crosshairs of his message. He looked people in the eye and said what no one wanted to hear. It was as if God had put coals in his mouth. Every sentence burned. He spoke of corruption with disgust on his face. He pointed at judges who twisted justice as easily as folding a cloth. He called the priests deceivers, people who claimed to be holy but sold religion like people sell products on the market. The prophets then were called pretenders, empty men, full of fine words but with no truth in their hearts. The people became so accustomed to error that they thought everything was normal. Lying became a joke, theft became cleverness, idolatry became fashionable. There were people who swore in the name of God one day and made offerings to other gods the next, as if nothing had happened. And when someone warned them, they laughed. Oh, God won't do anything, neither good nor bad. He's too quiet to care. It was this mockery that hurt Zephaniah the most, as if God were a statue, immobile, indifferent. But he knew that God's silence was never a sign of oblivion. It was just the interval before the answer. Zephaniah walked through the city like lightning. Every word was thunder. He warned one day it would come, and when it came it would be like a fire that doesn't choose what to burn. There would be no hiding place, no wall that could withstand it. And it wasn't just Judah that needed to hear this, because what lay ahead was going to cross borders, tear up maps and reach peoples who didn't even know what awaited them. "Silence before the Lord God," he shouted one day in the middle of the square. Passers-by stopped. Some children grabbed the hem of their mother's skirt, frightened by the tone. It was as if even the wind had stopped to listen. Zephaniah was no longer talking about something far away. Now he was bringing judgment closer, like someone announcing a storm already on the roof, the day of the Lord that people treated as an old wives' tale. He said he was knocking at the door, and he wasn't coming with a party. What he was describing wasn't symbolic, it was real. Houses would be abandoned, streets would be empty, shouts of joy would turn into groans. The gold, it would turn to dust. Those people who thought they were untouchable, surrounded by wealth and pride, were going to be blown out of their comfort like dry leaves blown by the wind. He spoke of animals disappearing, of cities falling silent, as if life had suddenly vanished. The images he used entered the mind and never left. It was as if he were painting an entire scene with words. Dark skies, the smell of smoke, the hurried footsteps of people who are trying to escape but have nowhere else to run. And the most impressive thing, it wasn't just Judah who was on target. The wrath he was announcing was like a giant wave about to engulf everything in its path. Judah's neighbors, who felt secure in their own mistakes, were also on the list. He wasn't just speaking as the prophet of a nation, but as a voice across borders. It was the kind of truth that no one wanted to hear, but that no one could forget afterwards. And then he started calling out the names, one by one, as if God had made a list and delivered it into the prophet's hands. Moab, Ammon, Ethiopia, Assyria, none were left out. Zephaniah's words cut through the air like a sharp knife. There was no political tone, no light speech. It was a denunciation. It was a sentence. He spoke like someone who had seen the end before it had even begun. Moab and Ammon, Israel's old enemies, would be treated with the same contempt they had shown. "They have mocked and trampled on my people as if they were dry land," said the prophet. "Now they would be deserts, a dwelling place of thorns, a place where no one would sing anymore. Their pride would be buried under the dust." Ethiopia to the south seemed far away, out of reach, but not to God. "You too will fall by the sword," he announced, and about Assyria he spared no words. That powerful nation which had dominated everything and everyone, full of self-confidence, said in its heart, "I am, and there is no other besides me." A phrase that echoed arrogance. But Zephaniah, his eyes fixed and his chest firm, replied, "You will be a desolation, a dwelling place for owls and beasts of the field." The irony was strong. Rich cities would become abandoned fields. Palaces would become ruins. Where there was celebration, only the sound of the wind whistling between the broken stones would remain. Those who used to laugh at others would now be a laughing stock. It was as if God was returning everything in the same coin, and with interest. The words came out of Zephaniah's mouth with such weight that they seemed to have body, weight, and smell. And yet, even after calling entire nations to account, he knew there was still something more urgent, more painful, because the people who heard his voice the most were the ones who learned the least. And that was what bothered Zephaniah the most. It wasn't just the enemies outside who were in the wrong. It was Judah, his own people, who seemed deaf. He spoke, he warned, he begged, but the words came back. It was like sowing seeds on stones. The city that was supposed to be an example was the most stubborn. Jerusalem dressed itself in religiosity, but its heart was far from God. The leaders, predators disguised as leaders. He said, "They are like lions that devour everything around them." Judges sold themselves easily, like someone who exchanges justice for coins. Prophets invented visions to please. Priests broke the law as if it were something worthless. And the people followed their rhythm as if it were normal. God had not stood still. Every morning he showed his justice. The sun rose, the air entered the lungs, the days went on. It was a daily reminder, there's still time, but no one paid attention. Time passed, and hearts remained hard. Evil became habit. Hope looked like an old picture hanging on the wall. It was there, but nobody looked at it anymore. Zephaniah walked those streets with watchful eyes. At every corner, with every gesture, he saw the distance between what the people said and what they actually experienced. It was as if they had become so accustomed to wrongdoing that they could no longer smell the rot. But he knew that God would not allow it to go on forever. And while everything around him seemed lost, an image began to form in his words. Something almost no one expected. In the midst of that cracked earth of pride and disobedience, Zephaniah saw something that no one else saw. A spark, a remnant. A kind of people who didn't make a fuss, who had no titles or riches, but carried a silent faith in their hearts. He called them a remnant, like the embers that remain hidden under the ash after the fire has gone out. They didn't live for appearances, nor did they follow the crowd. They were humble, sincere, people who still trusted in the Lord's name when everyone else said he wouldn't do anything. They didn't rely on gold or status. They were the opposite of everything the people had become. While the others ran after power, they chose the truth even if it meant walking alone. Zephaniah spoke of them with care, like someone protecting something fragile. He said that they would be guarded in the day of wrath, like someone who hides a treasure in time of war. Not because they were perfect, but because they sought justice, sought humility, and didn't sell themselves for applause. They didn't raise flags, they didn't appear in the circles of the powerful, but they had something that no one else had, a heart that still knew how to listen. While the world hardened, they kept their hearts soft, willing to change, to surrender, to start again. And it was because of them that hope had not yet died for good. Because what God would do with this small group, no one could have imagined. Zephaniah began to reveal glimpses of a new time, where shame would give way to restoration, where what was now weeping would turn into singing. But that was yet to come, hidden in the future, waiting for the right time. And he knew what God had prepared went far beyond Judah. Zephaniah began to speak of a time that sounded almost like a dream. Not because it was impossible, but because it was too different from what everyone was used to. He said that God, the same one who had announced judgment, would also be responsible for raising up the fallen people. The Lord himself would take the proud, those who beat their chests full of themselves, out of their midst, and leave only the humble, those who trusted, even if they didn't understand everything. Just imagine a city without pride, where no one thought they were better than anyone else, where the people wouldn't need lies or tricks to survive. A simple people, but whole. Zephaniah spoke with his eyes shining, as if he could see it happening right in front of him, and then he said something that became an image in the minds of those who heard it. God would be in their midst, not just as a distant presence, but as a warrior who saves. But the strangest and most beautiful thing was what came next. He said that this God would sing for joy. That's right, he would sing, like a father who cradles his child in his arms after a fright, like someone who finds what they love again and can't contain their happiness. It was hard to imagine. The God that so many had treated as severe now appeared as a companion, celebrating the people with song. Zephaniah used strong but sweet words that seemed to touch where no one else did. People who carried shame, guilt, fear would now be restored. What was dirty would be cleansed. What was far away would be brought back. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that this restoration would not only be for Judah. It wasn't a small, closed thing. It was as if something bigger was about to happen, coming from far away, from where no one expected it. And it was then that Zephaniah opened the door to the future with something no one expected. He began to speak of distant peoples, people who weren't even part of Judah's history, but who would also be reached. It was as if God was gathering up scattered pieces of the world and saying, "I want them all back." From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, he said, as if pointing to a place that, for many people at the time, was just a vague idea, a point far away on the map. From there, people would come to give their offerings to the Lord, not out of obligation, but out of desire, a desire born of truth. This was too big to fit within Judah's borders. It was as if the promise began there, but spread like the wind, reaching peoples, cultures, and languages. He no longer spoke only with the tone of one who warns. Now there was something new in his voice, a warmth. He spoke of purity, of humility, of a people who would no longer practice injustice, who would not lie, who would have nothing to be ashamed of. It was a kind of new humanity, rebuilt from within, not by weapons or kings, but by the presence of God dwelling among them. And most touching of all was the image of a people who were quiet but at peace, a people who would rest, who would eat in safety, who would no longer be afraid, a people who had previously lived in hiding, suffocated by shame and loss, would now be lifted up before everyone. Zephaniah's words became almost a song, a different song made of promise, made of healing. But even as he painted this beautiful future, he knew the story didn't end there. Because after all that had been said, something happened, something that nobody recorded in detail, but which changed the course of the kingdom. And after that, silence. Zephaniah's voice is no longer heard in the pages of history. No record of his death. No description of his old age, no farewell. He simply disappears, like a flame that has burned brightly for a while and suddenly goes out, not out of weakness, but because it had already done what needed to be done. Only the echo of his words remained, passing through time like the wind that continues to blow even after the thunder has passed. But his silence speaks volumes, because not long after the prophecies, something began to change. Josiah, the young king, the one who grew up in the midst of confusion, began one of the most profound reforms in Judah's history. He tore down idols, cleansed the temple, and sent the people back into covenant with God. It was as if someone had finally listened, and those who paid attention connected the dots. It was as if the seed that Zephaniah had planted with his words had begun to sprout there, among the rubble of idolatry. No one gave him credit at the time, no pat on the back, no title of honor, but his cries, his courage, his visions, all of this was stored away like dry wood waiting for the right spark. He spoke of destruction, but he also announced hope. He showed that God cares for the whole world, but also sees the individual heart. He warned of judgment, but revealed a love that sings, that welcomes, that restores. Zephaniah's story ends the way it began, simply, directly, without fanfare. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He said what needed to be said, and then kept quiet. But what he left behind echoes to this day like a mark in stone, because Zephaniah teaches us that even in dark times there is still a voice that rises up, a voice that is not afraid to tell the truth, even if it hurts. He showed that God sees everything, the error, the injustice, the falsehood hidden behind appearances, but he also sees those who stand firm, even without applause. He sees the small, the humble, those who still have faith in their hearts while the world around them is falling apart. And it is for these that he promises to remake everything. He promises to wipe away the shame, to bring back what was lost, to sing over them with joy. Zephaniah was not powerful. He had no army, no crowd behind him, but he had courage and a clear vision of what was right. He was God's mouthpiece at a time when everyone was covering their ears. He didn't speak to please, he spoke to awaken. And it is this courage that is often lacking today, the courage to be truthful when everyone prefers silence. We learn from him that God's judgment isn't just punishment, it's also care. It's like a father who corrects, not out of anger, but out of love. And that after correction always comes consolation. Zephaniah reminds us that there is justice, yes, but there is also mercy. That the same God who tears down raises up, that the same God who silences sings. And perhaps this is the most profound lesson. When all seems lost, hope can still be born. Even in the midst of ruin, God still writes new beginnings. That's what Zephaniah saw, even when no one else believed. And that's what we need to remember, especially now. If you liked Zephaniah's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.